Welcome back to the channel where today I'm testing and reviewing a really neat local storage option from Orico. So mini PCs are a really neat and often very cost effective way of getting some decent compute power. And the 2024 Apple Mac Mini also provides one of the best value ways to get a powerful Mac in some time. But what is great about the form factor is also one of the biggest limitations. They provide very little room for expandability. And though some of these come with NVMe slots for additional storage, a great way to increase their flexibility is by using external docks that provide more port access and flexibility around adding mass storage for backups or bulky items like media. I have a Mac Mini 2024 that I use for my video creation workflows, including audio recording and video editing, etc. And I also have some mini PCs that I've used for build-it-yourself NAS devices. I'm going to link a couple of those related videos below, but I'm always on the lookout for great options to add additional connectivity and storage to these devices. So today I'm looking in depth at the Orico MiniTower 2-bay RAID enclosure. For disclosure, Orico sent me this product to review, but no money's changing hands, my review is independent, and it's based on my experience and opinion on the product. Orico also don't know what will be in this review until they see it, just like you. Amazon affiliate links are posted below for the device, and all the SSDs and hard disks that I use in this testing. Now, there's a growing list of options for external USB and Thunderbolt storage, but what caught my eye on this unit is the ability to not only expand the number of USB ports and to have an additional SSD, but this unit also allows for the addition of two 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch disks, which offers great cost per terabyte for large-scale data storage. And what I thought was especially interesting was the built-in hardware RAID option, which either provides additional performance with RAID 0 or data redundancy for storage with RAID 1. And it provides some other options also. We'll get to that shortly. So let's look at this, consider its build quality, features, port options and performance test what the various storage options might look like so you can see if it's going to be a good addition to your desktop. Starting out, quickly unboxing the unit, we get the storage tower itself, which looks nicely designed. It has an aluminium construction and its size exactly to match the 2024 Mac Mini's footprint. It looks like it might sit nicely on top of the Mac, but the marketing materials show it alongside, and as we will come to, I wouldn't have it sat on top. It also comes with a couple of USB-C 3.2 cables and a small power brick adapter, and this plugs into the back of the unit along with the USB-C cable, which are going to go to the Mac Mini. There's also two USB 2.0 ports here and some jumpers which are used to configure the SATA RAID options. We're going to come back to those later. At the front, there's a further USB 2 port and then also a 10 gigabits per second USB 3.2 Gen 2 port. Now of course, the USB ports on the host device is going to be carrying all the bandwidth from all these USB ports as well as the built-in NVMe slot, the 2-bay SATAs, and in most cases I would say it's unusual to be oversaturating this link from the I/O on the device, but it could be possible if the storage is busy. Now you could plug this into the back of your Mac to keep it looking neat, but bear in mind that if you're using a 2024 Mac Mini like I am, these back ports are where your Thunderbolt 4 connections are, so you may not want to use these for USB 3.2. For non-Mac devices, it's a different story. Though it is styled like it's a Mac, there's absolutely no reason it's only useful for a Mac. This device also provides some storage options with an NVMe slot in the rear, which looks to provide a single PCIe Gen 3 lane and then two SATA bays inside where you can install 3.5 or 2.5-inch drive. The trays that are provided allow you to use either of these drive types, so you can install spinning disks or SATA SSD drives. I'm going to be performance testing various options here to see what you can expect and what the storage options make sense to install. There's also an SD card slot here at the front, which you may find valuable, but others just won't care about at all. And this is what I thought differentiated this product and what I really liked about it and convinced me to review it. It has some really flexible options for storage which make it great for some additional density of USB ports, but it also offers that NVMe, SATA and SD storage options to use for additional capacity and for options like backup. If you watch my channel, you know that I use large capacity disks and I'm a data hoarder, so the 3.5-inch bays especially I think are interesting. Now that said, and before we get to the testing, I do have a couple of observations from my testing and from using this product for the last few weeks. These are not major things, but I think a couple of minor design items that could be improved. And these are actually primarily related to installing the storage, so in reality they won't have a significant impact on use of the product after install. Okay, so firstly, the NVMe hatch at the back here is magnetic closure, and though this is a cool idea, There's a couple of irritations with this. Firstly, the retention screw for the SSD is right next to the hatch magnet, and this means that getting a screw in to retain the SSD can be annoying. The screw tends to get stuck to the magnet, etc. So you just need to use your finger to hold the screw onto the screwdriver. Also, the socket is inset in the unit and there isn't much finger room, so inserting and removing the SSD is a bit fiddly, but for most people this is going to be a one-time job, so it's not a serious issue. It's not ideal for cooling either, as though it has an aluminium cover. I personally didn't receive a heat pad with the device. I used my own, but I had to actually use 2 times 1mm heat pads to get the SSD to contact the cover, and honestly the heat transfer from that door to the chassis isn't that great anyway, so dissipating heat from the SSD into that large aluminium chassis doesn't work super well. However, this NVMe is connected to a single Gen 3 lane and then onto a USB 3.2 connection, so providing only a maximum around 10 gigabits per second anyway, right? So you don't really get the benefit from using fast and hot SSDs anyway. As we will see, heat-based throttling does not appear to be an issue with this device. So again, the above is a niggle and not an issue that I would use to alter your decision on the device, but I am going to performance test a selection of SSDs so you can see what to expect. If we look inside, we see the SATA bays, and you can mount your 2.5 or 3.5 inch drives in these metal caddies and slide them in and then place the cover on top. This I think is actually really nice, and it gives you huge capacity potential in a small form factor. There are 2 bays, and where this device really shines brightly is it provides hardware RAID. You can configure the drives to use either RAID 0, RAID 1, you can expose them individually, or you can put them in a JBOD volume. And there's several benefits here, and I'll come back to this with the performance testing. But this is something I like most about this device. There are a few USB hubs around at this price point, but the 2 SATA bays with the hardware RAID is a real differentiator if you're looking for high capacity and cheaper local storage. Now, there is one minor niggle here also, and that is that the disk caddies are not keyed, so you can actually put the disk caddies in either orientation. Now, they're only going to work one way because of where the SATA ports are, but it is possible to insert them wrongly and they just won't work. So once you do seat it properly, you can kind of feel that it's in. So again, this is simple to deal with. Just put them in the correct way round, but having the slot designed to only work the correct way would definitely be a refinement. Okay, so let's get this connected now up to my 2024 Mac Mini test system. And first comment on this though is it's the same size as the Mac and you could stack them. Don't do this, especially if you have spinning disks. The shape of the base of the Mac Mini means that it isn't very stable and the unit can move. Now this isn't going to be an issue with SSDs inside, but it's not going to be so good for spinning disks. I would put this alongside. The device comes with a 1 meter USB-C cable, which has an A or C option on one end, and it also comes with a 15 centimeter USB-C to USB-C if you want to have it close and you want to keep it tidy. Any SATA or NVMe's installed will show up immediately in the disk utility in the Mac. Now, testing coming up next to confirm what performance you can expect from these different setups. But remember, it is a USB 3.2 device, so the maximum throughput in either direction is going to be about 900 to 1000 megabytes per second once you factor in protocol overhead, etc. The NVMe port is also a single lane Gen 3 slot, so again, it's limited to about the same 1000 megabytes per second in practical terms. If you do want higher speed SSD access than this, then you need to be looking at a Thunderbolt 4 device. And I've covered a few of these in this channel, and there's going to be more coming in this area. Okay, now before we get to the testing, let's look at one of the best features of this device, and this is the hardware RAID capability. This is for the SATA ports only, but for those who do want the detail, it uses the Realtek 9210B USB to PCI bridge to support the PCIe slot and other ports, and then it uses an AS Media 1352R SATA chipset to manage the RAID and the drives. This all provides 10 gigabits per second USB interface to the host. Now, my Mac in this case, and then a PCIe lane to the NVMe slot, and then to the SATA and the USB ports. Then the AS Media chip provides the SATA interface, and it gives you that support for RAID 0, 1, JBOD and native pass-through. So I'm going to run through some tests now so we can see what this hardware RAID compares to, both in terms of the native disk utility RAID and SoftRAID. Given the bandwidth limitation on the USB interface, using hardware RAID does come with some advantages, but there are also some considerations. But in all cases, remember that RAID is not a backup, and you should keep backups on your data on multiple devices, ideally on different media types, and having an offline copy in a different location is the gold standard if the data is really important. So first of all, let's run some tests on various SSDs in that NVMe slot to find out what you can expect from different SSDs when installed. Now the drives I'm testing here are all 1 terabyte in size as an example. Okay, so starting with the write testing. First of all, we have the crucial P3, and this is a pretty budget card that's been around for a while, and it only supports Gen 3. When tested, this starts out at about 950 megabytes per second, but it drops down to about 400 before recovering back to 935 megabytes per second. Now this performance is more to do with the SSD than the Orico hub, but it does show that the USB and single NVMe Gen 3 lane interface limits max throughput to just under 1000 megabytes per second. Now what the performance graph reveals is how the SSD handles its SLC cache. If this is dynamic, how fast the SSD can write to NAND once that SLC cache is exhausted, and then that last jagged piece here on the graph, this is the SSD folding process. This is where it's converting that SLC cache into QLC configured NAND once the drive is nearly full. Next we look at the crucial P3 Plus. Now this card is almost identical to the P3, but it has a Gen 4 interface. So the reason that the performance test here is almost identical is that the Orico hardware is Gen 3, and testing these cards against each other will tell you if it is a Gen 3 or Gen 4 that's in use in the hardware. As the P3 Plus Gen 4 card is operating in Gen 3 mode, they will behave very similarly to each other. Okay, so next we move on to some TLC NAND cards, and these are still not what I would consider high-end cards, but they're solid, and due to the bandwidth available on that USB 3.2 and Gen 3 interface, a really fast card probably isn't going to be the best spend you can make in terms of value. So let's look first at the crucial T500. Now this card hits a solid 1000 megabytes per second, and it stays there for 340 gigabytes of non-stop data writes. Once it runs out of the SLC cache, the write speed drops to around 560 megabytes per second, and it maintains this all the way until the drive is full. And this looks like a well-suited card for this device. And finally, the WD-SN7100 card. This one displays a very similar performance profile in the Oracle dock as the T500, but is overall a little slower. Now again, this is not one of WD's higher end cards. It's more mid-range, and it's actually a replacement, I believe, for the previous gen SN770. It has lower power consumption and uses host memory for DRAM cache, whereas the T500 has DRAM on board. The SN7100 also comes in a little cheaper. Now if we look at read performance, I think this is interesting. The P3 delivers just over 700 megabytes per second consistent read across the entire drive when reading in the entire contents, and the P3 Plus is, unsurprisingly, very similar given their shared implementation. Once we look at those higher end cards, we can see that the crucial T500 is able to sustain a very consistent 900 megabytes per second across the entire drive, and from experience this is likely the maximum read throughput from this USB 3.2 device. I don't know if it's related to the Realtek chipset or the USB itself, but other USB 3.2 devices I looked at had a very similar behavior where the write speed actually had a faster maximum than the read speed, so this isn't specific to the Orico device. Looking also at the WD-SN7100, it's a similar story. It's not quite as clean, but there's very little in it. Okay, so for NVMe performance, you can expect a maximum about 1000 megabytes per second write, 900 megabytes per second read, and you need a mid-tier card like the T500 or the SN7100 to achieve this. These tests are, however, for a full drive write and read, and as you likely wouldn't be using an NVMe over USB for high-intensity storage workloads, you probably won't pay any significant real-world penalty for going for a cheaper card like the P3 or the P3 Plus. So I'm going to link all of those below so you can check the prices, but typically there's actually only a few dollars in it at the 1 terabyte range, and the gap typically isn't massive as you go up the capacity range. So just check your options and then pick something that provides good value and maybe is on offer. Now let's look at those SATA baits, and for this I think personally what is really interesting is how using the hardware RAID based on the ASM1352R chipset compares to using software, for example OWC SoftRAID or the native Mac RAID assistant. So let's look at RAID 0 and RAID 1 options here and compare. So again, I want to be clear, quick reminder that RAID 0 here is good when you're working with larger files and want performance, but you're not relying on the safety of the storage, whereas RAID 1 is best suited to redundant storage, but performance is less important. RAID of any kind, again, is not a backup, usual reminder. I also tested this with both spinning disks, in this case a pair of Ironwolf 4TB NAS drives, and SATA SSDs, and in this case it was a pair of 2TB Samsung 870 EVOs. I would expect to see different behaviours here due to the speed of the drives, but also the access latency. So let's see how the hardware RAID stacks up against it in software on the Mac. All tests use 64K blocks and continuous writes and reads of large 10GB files. First of all, the hard disks. Now for 2 times 4TB drives in an 8TB RAID 0 array, write performance here was almost identical for the hardware as well as for SoftRAID, and actually for the Mac configuration in Disk Utility RAID Assistant. The Ironwolf's max out at about 200 megabytes per second, so you can see that in all cases the drives are really written to at full speed. The Mac RAID seems a little more prone to dropouts, but it is minor. Read performance from the RAID 0 hard disk is also about the same between RAID implementation. Reads are very slightly above writes, as you would expect. Next we try a RAID1 mirror, and though again the write speeds are quite similar, the Mac RAID Assistant was again a little less consistent. SoftRAID and the hardware implementation perform very closely. Now interestingly though, read speeds are better on the hardware implementation. It looks like both the software RAIDs may pull data from both disks across the USB before the read operation, and the performance is around 60% that of the hardware RAID. So the RAID Assistant also seems to perform worse than the OWC SoftRAID implementation. So this is a bonus point I think for the hardware. Now let's move over and run those tests on the Samsung 870 EVO SSDs. Now these are well performing SSDs, and the die write speed on these is sufficient that the NAND should not be the bottleneck when used at SATA speeds. Firstly, there's a pair of 2TB disks in a 4TB RAID 0 array. And here we see a really significant performance advantage of using the hardware RAID. It isn't clear to me why the software implementations are slower here, but it may be because the software isn't as efficient at switching between the two disks to write the stripes. But in this case, the hardware option gets solid performance out of both disks and delivers around 75% more performance than the software implementations. And this is broadly true for the reads also, where the increase is around 55%. Now if we look at the RAID1 mirror for these disks, it's a similar pattern with around a doubling of performance for the hardware. Again, the software RAID here will have to send the data over the USB twice to write to each disk. When using the hardware, the data will only need to be sent once to the controller, which will then write the data to both disks. So it's definitely a more efficient use of the USB interface. Reads are, however, much closer, with only about 2% difference between the hardware RAID and the SoftRAID, and a little more than around 15% difference for the Disk Utility RAID. And it's a little odd that performance penalty for RAID run reads on the HDD is higher than on the SSDs, but this could actually be related to I/O latency, and the duplicate reads on the HDDs take longer to complete relatively. So I found these results actually really interesting, and it shows that hardware RAID comes with some real benefits. For RAID 1 performance on the hard disks, it's really significant upside if using SATA SSDs. Do consider though that recovery rate of a RAID volume on the Orico hardware if it fails is likely to need another device with the same ASM chipset, but as I've said repeatedly, RAID is not a backup, and you should back up your data, as RAID protects against failed disks. It does not protect against data corruption, accidental or malicious damage to files, or loss of the RAID volume due to software or hardware failure. Okay, now let's get to that summary. But before we do, just a really quick reminder, hit that like if you found this useful or interesting, and to sub for more storage content, algorithm, etc. Thank you immensely, it's really appreciated. So this product to me is actually really interesting. There's a few options for relatively low cost docks that allow you to add an SD reader, more USB ports, and even an NVMe, and I've previously looked at others, and they're handy given the limited ports on the Mac Mini, but there are very few options that give you the choice of adding a 3.5 or 2.5 inch drives. If you want larger storage, this one also providing RAID is really nice, especially as we see how this performs versus software RAID. With SATA SSDs especially, it provides actually really nice performance without the cost of going up to a Thunderbolt device. Now there are a couple of minor design niggles, but honestly they are minor inconveniences just during the initial install of the storage, and most will not touch these again after, so these are not a reason for me to negatively mark down the product. Aesthetically, it's a nice device and it doesn't take up too much room considering the options it's providing, so I personally can recommend this, and I know I'll be putting it to use. I think its price point is also reasonable at $150, and you can also check for voucher codes, and I have one actually that's valid for September and it's pasted below. There's an Amazon affiliate link also for the device. Please go check that out, I appreciate it. And as part of this testing for these charts I showed, I tested this device 24/7 for several weeks and it worked flawlessly. I did quite a bit of swapping of SSDs and disks and configuring partitions and deleting and running multi-day read-write tests, all very smooth. Just make sure it's mounted in a stable place if you are running spinning disks, and it looks like it would be good to put on top of the Mac, but I wouldn't do this. So that's it. Appreciate your time, thanks for watching to the end, and I will see you in the next.